It requires very little initial investment and relative to other industries such as resource extraction. And so in this sense, we can call it a low-hanging fruit of sorts, something that poor governments don't need to invest a lot of money into to get a lot of money back. All they really need to do is set the tax rates and watch the money roll in. So secondly, we can talk about how this affects poor governments, the governments of poor countries. Predominantly, these governments are amateurish, they're somewhat incompetent. And so when they have this free money, it breeds complacency. These governments usually squander the money, like say Kenya spent 60 million on cotton subsidies and to no real effect. Reflected in other developing countries, other poor countries in their higher corruption indexes. But even if the government does spend it on something constructive, they usually spend it, or they usually gear this money towards more tourism. They spend this money on national parks, they spend this money on roads or airports, or roads to resorts or airports. And so while these are not bad in and of themselves, the opportunity cost of building these pieces of infrastructure is not spending money on education, not spending money on different kinds of infrastructure, not spending money on healthcare, and not spending money on other public improvements. So from this we can conclude that tourism does not benefit the citizens as much as it should. And the government spends this money inefficiently and does not benefit the country very, very much. And so thirdly, let's look at the nature of the tourism industry in itself. Now, what we can agree on is that it does not really spread to rural areas very, very much, because the tourism industry focuses a lot on hotels, which usually reside in urban areas. For example, Chad has 80% of its population in rural areas, and so 80% of the population will not benefit from tourism. So, but even we can see when it is in urban areas, the locals do not benefit very much of it, because these companies outsource a lot of their talent, a lot of their staff, and so what the locals do earn is mostly lower. But yet this wage is still high enough to make a few side effects, which are not very good, such as dropping out of school in order to work for these companies, in order to be developing skills that are specific to the tourism industry, and limiting their future success, their future career prospects by only looking at tourism. So you can see that the nature of tourism does not really develop the majority of the country. It increases the rich-poor gap and limits the prospects of the citizens. No, thank you, sir. And so with these characterizations, we can see that a lot of poor countries are using tourism as a crutch. Government relies upon tourism cash in order to fuel its corruption, or in order to fuel further tourism. And so the government needs this consistent, steady flow of tax money in order to function. And tourism revenue rules all government processes. For example, we can see in Aruba, 27% of the GDP is tourism related, and in Anguilla, 86.4% of the exports are related to tourism. And the people as well in these countries rely upon the tourism industry. They develop tourism-specific skills, and they become accustomed to tourism as an anchor point, as something that they can rely on in order to earn money. For example, Bahamas, 30% of the population is in the hospitality, in the tourism business. So when we combine this with another point which I'm going to talk about, the cycle of tourism, we can see why this is really, really bad for these poor countries. Tourism is an industry fueled by disposable income. You do not need to go to Kenya like you need other kinds of things that other industries produce. And so we can see that the state of the economy, the state of how much money people have to spend, how much disposable income people have, reflects the state of the tourism industry. And as we all know, the economy isn't always hunky-dory. 2008 told us that much. And so we can see that as a result, 2008 was also a very, very poor year for the tourism industry. And so and from this, we all know that this crutch is now taken away from these governments. This crutch is now taken away from the people of these countries. And so this country, and so the government fails, and the people fail. So we can see ultimately that that tourism in poor countries is an unsustainable process. It's, the way that governments rely upon it is unhealthy. The way that people rely upon it is unhealthy, and the way that it encourages corruption and bad governance is also poor. The way that doesn't actually help the majority of the people within these countries is also not beneficial. And so we can see that tourism in poor countries is ultimately bad. So this is why side proposition firmly believes that tourism is bad for poor countries. Thank you very much.
See from the side proposition is that they rest the case entirely on a few assumptions. Firstly, they believe that poor countries poor countries are doomed to have amateur governments who have no economic sense, who have no sense of how to manage their economy, how to manage their resources. Well, firstly, we don't concede that. We believe that given that they are poor countries, they will be able and can consult foreign investors and foreign countries about effective models to development, and we see that is an effective way that will then bring lots of economic success for the country. They also seem to believe that the government mismanagement, right, is only inherent to tourism as the way of economic development. But we see that in any sense of economic development, right? If we have any other industry, such as the mining industry coming in for resource extraction, or any other form of international trade, we will see that the same situation will occur. Just simply because they might have amateur governments who are relatively inexperienced, that doesn't mean this problem is unique just to tourism. No, thank you, sir. Furthermore, they also seem to assume in their rural versus city analogy that all tourists are attracted to city areas and they will neglect rural areas. Now we see that in the majority of Africa, the prime attraction is scenery. The prime attraction is the natural habitat. So we don't see why the tourists won't be incentivized to go to these areas and therefore help the people in these natural habitats and gain, and therefore the country will gain from that. And then furthermore, we also see that they have said. We also see that they have said that once tourism is introduced to the country, then the economy will be entirely dependent on tourism. But we don't see that, right, ladies and gentlemen? We see that once tourism brings in tourists, for example, investors, families, other people of political connections, for example, that will invigorate and that will act as a catalyst for further industries and further diversification of the economy. So therefore, the economy will benefit. No, thank you, sir. And finally, they believe that tourism is unsustainable. But however, as our side will seek to prove today, we believe that this depends on the management of tourism, and we believe that this can be done and will be done, as we outlined. So, ladies and gentlemen, what is the problem we see today? We see that there are many lost domestic economies characterized by their citizens being poor. We see that they have low economic activity and they have private forms of industry. So they rely primarily on a domestic economy that runs for example, for simple meeting the needs of everyday needs such as food, and then trading that within the domestic economy. We see that the problem is that they're not very noticed by the international community, and they have little interest by investors and foreign governments. So what the problem is that their pool of money is limited because they do not have international economic interaction. When the pool of money is limited, and you are poor, then you're just going to remain poor until foreign money and foreign injections of cash comes into the country. And we see today that tourism is fundamental to this process. Why? Well, firstly, we're not saying that tourism is magical. No, thank you. It's a magical answer to the problem. But we simply see that as a catalyst that will provoke and attract different people and will speed interest into the country, increase the exposure of the country, and aid development. Okay, so as the first speaker, what am I advocating for today? I'm advocating for a people-centered policy towards tourism that goes to benefit local economies. And we see that this can be done through effective management, such as encouraging the joint ventures and ethical and ecotourism, which will definitely make sure that the benefits go back to local communities.
Sir,
yes.
Do you ever think that the government keeps its grubby hands to itself in these joint ventures?
Okay, thank you. So in terms of corruption, we do see that corruption in poor countries is a problem. But again, we see it is not unique to tourism, ladies and gentlemen. Corruption exists already, and corruption already exists in the form that is damaging the people's life and not letting them development. And we see that tourism, at least it brings the money in, and even though some money might go to the corrupt government, at least by the nature of it trickling down, eventually some benefits will be drawn, and a long process of development will ensure that eventually the government becomes more transparent. Okay, so firstly, what do we see is that we actually see that the government gaining more tax revenue can actually enable them to further invest not just into the tourism, but into local usages and benefit local people. We see that jobs and business opportunities will be created, which include direct tourism industries such as attractions and hotels, but also support industries such as food production. So what are we looking at? We view that the example of Serengeti in Kenya was actually a good example of how tourism was used when tourists came to Kenya to view the annual migration of wild beasts and zebra. So we see that investment was actually put into this country that actually benefited education and benefited infrastructure, and Kenya is now a country with a relatively higher GDP than much of Africa. And with this example, what we see that, yes, there might be some problems. Yes, the corruption might occur, but eventually once you get the money pulled in, once you have foreign cash injected into the local community, even though some of it may be wasted, our vision is that eventually it will go back to benefiting the local people. And we see that once people become richer and their call for benefiting themselves becomes stronger, then we see the multiplier effect, means that more money into the economy will generate more economic activity, and in the end, people will benefit. So ladies and gentlemen, this is why side opposition is very.
On their side of the house, they first say there is no bad governance. We don't believe all these poor countries have these bad governments to begin with, even though we've given numerous examples on our side of the house. But not only that, today in the debate, I not only want to give you more information or characterizations of why we think these are bad governments, but also the kind of incentives for them to be a bad government. They talk about all these kind of money management issue, but we say these kind of beautiful joint ventures will fall apart if there's no incentive for diversification of the economy. And in my other rebuttals, I'll be talking about this idea of the actual trickle-down effect. Does it benefit the people? In my main substantive, I'll be talking about the environment. So, firstly, this idea of bad governance. They kind of threw a blanket statement like, no, we don't think these poor countries are bad governments. Apart from our Kenya example, we have a Malaysia example where they squandered 247 million on a dam that did not benefit the people, not economically or humanitarian, in the humanitarian needs. And they ask, well, why is that so bad? Because the thing we said from our very first speaker is opportunity cost. That could have gone into education. That could have gone into healthcare. Do you know how many people die of AIDS because they're unable, and how that affects the kind of development of a country? You see, when you really examine development and the effect on kind of a poor country's development into a more developed one, you see, you look at things like education, basic health stuff, not this quick, cheap, money-making tourism industry. Thank you, sir. But then you said, well, if they're bad governments anyways, well, then they're bad governments anyways. All kind of things will fall apart in that scenario. You see, ladies and gentlemen, we're not only saying they're bad governments, we're saying this tourism industry reinforces that, ladies and gentlemen. And it makes it worse because we talked about the low-hanging fruit. Give us an incentive for why these governments will want to look at the long-term kind of benefits in most of these cases, where there's kind of weak governmental link, no thank you, sir, already in many of these countries. Why they can even think about reaching for that high fruit up there. Now we want to look at how does it actually benefit the people. We talked about all these kind of vague industries, how you require capital to develop, how this will spring up a billion kind of new industries and give labor to all these people. But we talked about that's exactly this thing. You keep them at that sweet spot where you give them labor, but it's unsustainable because you give them labor at a low wage, so they drop out of school, ladies and gentlemen. Not only that, we say further on in my substantive, I'll talk about how they don't benefit from the infrastructure that you set up as well. Then you talked about, no thank you ma'am, these ideas of joint ventures. Once again, government, why won't they keep their grubby hands to themselves? And now finally on this idea of this kind of low wages and trickle-down effect, you talk about Kenya and, yes sir.
How is this unique to tourism? Why is it just tourism that might cause corruption if they're inherently already corrupt?
Sir, we talked about this idea of low-hanging fruit. We actually think resource extraction, why isn't it, because that's your inherent insinuation there, why isn't resource extraction or other industries the low-hanging fruit? Because it requires little capital to start up. You said so yourself, joint ventures. It's so easy to perhaps like start it up in this kind of small-scale business, whereas resource extraction requires a lot of more cooperation, a lot more infrastructure, and a lot more frameworks in place there. Now onto my main substantive. Going back to our characterization set up beautifully by our first speaker, we said that tourism is easy money, government's not just bureaucratic, it's lazy and incompetent, in contrast to the power of tourism. Because he talked about the economic power of these kind of foreign companies. But I'm going to talk about the political one and that effect on the environment. There's something about big MNCs, perhaps with exploitative intents, going into a poor country with a government that is willing to follow the dollars and bucks. is there not difficulty in regulation? Who looks at the industry standards? We see when the government looks the other way, intentionally or unintentionally, depending on whether they're sleeping with the companies or not, tourism that isn't ecotourism goes unchecked. Because I think you're mainly talking about just ecotourism, ladies and gentlemen. It isn't. Just imagine this pristine city which isn't part of ecotourism because it's not a national park and it doesn't hold tigers. Now let 100 tourists run rampant through this city. You see, it's more than just wear and tear, this massive footprint left behind. There's rubbish that they leave behind that the locals have to live in. We've diverted water for tourists instead and exploit local reserves. Waste from hotels dumped into these places. Soil erosion, eroded grass cover. You ask, where was the old city when the main statue has been defaced by these tourists? And now, if you want to talk about the cyclical boom and bust of the tourism industry, which they completely ignore, we say there's a time frame involved. We look at why tourism is a kind of bubble industry. We never looked at our idea of crutch. Why is it especially so bad that when you take away a crutch from a country, it hurts so much? Because firstly, let's establish this crutch once more, this idea of international and domestic mechanisms, and how eventually there's going to be a down year. On top of that, if you're looking at your case of ecotourism, we see it's especially a niche market. To begin with, it doesn't garner enough money. These huge parks already have difficulty keeping up their natural reserves. So we say, at the end of the day, when you look at what's left for the people, they're still not being paid a lot. They don't benefit, and it's far-flung and isolated. You brought up this kind of rural city point, ladies and gentlemen, but I don't think the majority of the people live next to national parks. They confuse national parks with kind of rural areas. And we've already given you the statistics in my first speaker about what percentage of the population actually benefit from this. In the case of Serengeti, you talked about this idea of how the general GDP of Kenya was growing as a whole. But let me tell you, 10 years ago, when you go there, in terms of driving from the capital to the main park, it took you 3 hours. But now, when I last went there, it took me 10 hours because no one was bothered to keep up with the infrastructure, because no one cared anymore, ladies and gentlemen. They have failed their burden.
East side proposition shop to be explaining to us why tourism is so bad and therefore all the benefits brought by tourism can be neglected for poor countries. Now firstly, they have told us that the problem they're very concerned with is that governments will be incompetent to deal with the money earned, and that the opportunity cost of the money earned using the money earned from tourism is not going to be worth it. Now firstly, they have this very, very big assumption that all the benefits and all the money earned from tourism is going to go towards more tourism instead of other things such as education or healthcare systems, which is not the case because they didn't provide us with any examples on this. Next, and regarding that point as well, under the trend of globalization, we see that countries are sharing their experiences, and the more developed countries could then be sharing their experiences on how they developed their tourism economy to these lesser developed countries and make sure the money earned does not go to waste. Now next, they also told us about the problem of maybe countries will be over-reliant on tourism, which is fueled by disposable income. No thank you, ma'am. Which is unhealthy for these lesser developed countries. However, the thing is, the problem that these lesser developed countries are very poor does exist, and to solve it, so far we do not see any other efficient way. And even if we went for other solutions such as trade, there are the problems therefore itself, and countries could also be over-reliant on trade itself. So does that mean because there are problems, no thank you ma'am, that we should not try to help these poor countries become richer? Now, ladies and gentlemen, today we understand that there are flip sides to each and every solution. But as explained by my first speaker, we cannot say tourism is bad just because potential problems will arise when there are concrete benefits, especially in terms of economics, as explained by my first speaker.
Yes, sorry. Oh, okay, sorry. You talked about foreign investors in countries helping these poor countries. Can you give me a reason why they do so?
Okay, because under the trend of globalization, each and every single country is helping each other, and therefore we can see that countries should be helping each other, and not just because they're all selfish for themselves. So, ladies and gentlemen, we have a very far-sighted side opposition and an overly conservative and pessimistic proposition. Now, ladies and gentlemen, we see that tourism is an efficient way to stimulate the economy, and that there are indeed undeniable benefits. The cons that they brought up to us can be solved realistically through effective management and are not exclusive to tourism to such an extent that it overrides all benefits. Now, ladies and gentlemen, we have spotted a flaw in their case line, which is they seem to think that a bad government in a poor country is caused by tourism. Here's the catch they fail to understand. Tourism is not the cause for corruption in governments that already exist. And therefore, no thank you, sir. And the thing is, with this tourism, we are trying to improve the country and not just making it worse. Now, ladies and gentlemen, would you rather a poor country stay poor with no catalyst towards development simply due to an irrational fear of problems which can be solved through management and international help and share of experience, when a solution is right there in front of our eyes, which is tourism? Now, ladies and gentlemen, they also expressed the concerns about the ecosystem after poor countries develop tourism. However, they have to understand that tourism does not mean they're opening up land or the reserves to all tourists. Again, if we focus on effective management, which is very realistic and can be achieved in this case, the entire ecosystem being destroyed is not going to be a very big problem. Now, let me move on to social benefits brought to these countries through tourism. Firstly, the development of a cultural identity. Now, ladies and gentlemen, no matter how poor or how rich a country is, there must be something special about each country which reinforces identity. For example, in Bali, no thank you, ma'am. For example, in Bali, when tourists go to Bali, they are provided the opportunity to learn Balinese dance, which is something that is very unique and special in their culture. And when they go there, they get to learn it and they get to spread it.
Wait a minute.
Yes, sir.
Bali is part of India, and India has one of the largest economies in the world. It is by no means any kind of poor country. Furthermore, India is
Okay, thank you, sir. However, in Bali, there are still some poor parts, so we are using this as a sort of example for like how poor countries could also work out. Next, infrastructure. So there are roads, bridges, natural reserves, and railways built in poor places such as Africa, and we see that these infrastructures can help to improve the lives of the people. And as the second speaker already stated, well, there might be problems because people fail to keep up with these infrastructures and thus they decay. However, as we already stated, effective management is the key. So when we get the money, we use it for effective management, and then these white elephant projects will not have existed. Now, thirdly, we'll be raising awareness. For example, in Cambodia, the educational trips that people provide for people to go to Cambodia, when they're provided with opportunities to encounter human trafficking victims, which raises awareness of these problems in these poor countries among the international society. Now, about conservation of the environment, this encourages community beautification and revitalization when so many tourists are going to this country to look at, for example, the beautiful scenery, and encourages the preservation of resources. And lastly would be cultural exchange. For example, in Malaysia, there are homestay programs that villages offer. For example, the village in Sabah, where people can go there and stay at homestay families' homes. Firstly, they pay a certain amount of fee, which helps these rural villages to develop. And at the same time, they can exchange their cultures. For example, they would provide you with a local food, and they would show you like the rivers and forests within that area, where and you can give back by sharing your experiences, and thus cause cultural exchanges. So, ladies and gentlemen, today's side opposition stands here because we see that there is indeed a problem for these poor countries, and we are here to help, and we see tourism is the best way to do it. Thank you.
In terms of that, we have to get more education.
Today I'll be talking about, first of all, what is the rational calculus of one of these poor governments? Second of all, what does tourism do to actually exacerbate the negative sides of this rational calculus? And the culture environment, is that preserved or not? And then finally, this idea of foreign investors and how there's something going to come in and magically fix all the management problems of these poor governments. So, starting off with my first class, which is what is the rational calculus of these governments? Well, we came here and told you that the rational calculus of these governments, and they seem to agree, is that they're incompetent. They are just not the best at managing their economics and managing their people. And not only that, they only see the immediate. They only see the sort of immediate return. And that's okay, that's understandable, because when you're sort of, as they said, as they actually characterize themselves, always been working to provide for the immediate sort of needs, for example, food on the table, sort of like surviving this day, when you've always been working to sort of provide for those immediate needs, then when you're actually managing your economics, you're not actually unable to see in the long run. And we see this as a fatal flaw inside proposition, because we see when you're unable to view long-run economics, and you're unable to see what's actually better for the long-term development and the long-term growth of your country, that's when the real problem happens. So I'm going to ignore this whole idea of like corruption can't be fixed, all countries are corrupt, all countries are not corrupt. I'm just going to ignore that and talk about why the actual incompetence, which you both agree on, is just as fatal as corruption. So that's the whole idea of what the irrational calculus is. It's immediate, it's incompetent, they can't see past what will get them immediate benefit. Okay, now second of all, what does tourism do to actually exacerbate this incompetence, exacerbate the fact that they're unable to provide in the long run? We see that tourism is the definition of immediate return. What you do is you set up a few like little sort of shops, a few like little parks, and something you have tourism and something you have money. And that's great. But what do you see after that? The government doesn't see, no thank you. The government's unable to see past the fact that once you've gotten a tourism business set up, soon that ends up becoming your main business. Soon tourism is actually what you rely on because it grows and grows and grows, and you think that if you continue investing, you'll continue getting more money, and it's just a cycle where you just don't actually end up being able to use that money on anything else, first of all. And second of all, this idea of immediate return, again, is too much of a temptation to sort of say, okay, we're going to move on from tourism now. And before you know it, you have a country whose immediate economy is volatile. No thank you, because it depends on other countries' sort of ability to spend sort of luxury money. Second of all, again, it's just completely, it's very dependent. And third of all, it's very sort of low reaching. Again, you're stuck in this sort of, for example, most like locals, since they outsource, as we talked about, these managerial positions, most locals are stuck in these sort of minimum jobs where they're not actually getting that much education, where they're not actually learning skills they can apply in different areas. Most locals actually, so we see these businesses that's volatile, dependent, and actually sort of the citizens are settling for less than they actually could if they've been properly educated. So that's what we see tourism does to the sort of the economy. And what we've been saying on side proposition down the bench in a second, what we've been saying on side proposition down the bench is that we see that the government needs, because the government's in, like sort of inability to see past immediate effects, we see that this tourism industry is a very fatal trap to fall into, because once you start with this immediate return, you can't stop. And we've been telling you again and again that we believe putting money into more long-term growth types of economies, like for example, increasing your education, or increasing, like putting in the startup money that you would have put in tourism into education, into healthcare, into education, into healthcare, into any of the other industries that could actually help the growth and health of your people, is actually much better, because in the long run, what you see is, although there's no immediate benefit, education not only has much more, and healthcare, all this has much more far-reaching benefits, not just in the sense that they affect a lot more people, because when you have tourism industries, sure, you need a couple tourists, but you're outsourcing most of the positions that actually create change in the country. So you see, not only it's much more far-reaching because it affects more people, but second of all, the actual returns increase again and again, time and time again. Because you see, in a second, I'll actually take it this time. You see not just that like these people are actually sort of getting immediate change and sort of improve their lives a little bit just immediately. You see in the long run, they're improving their lives massively, improving their children's life, improving those children's lives. Which is why we see that this sort of destructive cycle that we outlined is actually destroyed, and they're lifted out of the poverty cycle because of this sort of far-reaching benefit, which tourism actually does not have, and actually exacerbates the short-term sort of thought process. Yes.
Okay, so following your line of logic, if these poor countries are going to support further development in tourism, aren't they going to be incentivized to keep up resources, to keep growing the country instead of exhausting their resources?
Thank you. That's actually very awesome, because now I'm going to talk about culture and environment and why, sure, you need some resources for tourism, but those actual areas you spend those resources on are very limited. Because what you see when you have culture and environment is they're not going to preserve the whole country, they're not going to preserve every single forest, they're not going to preserve every single culture. They're going to choose a culture they think can be most easily like Disneyfied, if you will, most easily made sort of tourist friendly, most sort of like, you know, tourists will come and be like, oh, that's cute, or oh, I want that hat or something. You know what I mean? So like, you see that they actually only preserve very limited areas of these places. So we see that it's not that they try to come up here and paint this picture that all culture will be preserved, all environment will be preserved, because the government has that much resource to spend on tourism. We see that's actually not the case. And these resources will be used to be funneled into some very specific areas and never actually reach out and sort of trickle down, as they said. Those areas will go rich, sure, but then not only will that create a rich-poor gap, but not only that, but none of the locals actually benefit, because it's all just sort of superficial change so that tourists can come, think it's pretty, spend more money, and have the money be funneled into the same areas again. So what we see here is in exchange for proper education, better health, sort of a long-term growth, you know, breaking the poverty cycle, we see that in exchange for that, you're just getting a couple national parks, maybe like one culture that's preserved and sort of put on posters, and sort of short-term benefits where you're making a little extra money, but not enough to actually lift you out in the long run. So those are those two things. And then finally, this last idea of foreign investors and how selling will come in, what we see here is that there's a couple promises. First of all, these mismanaged governments, because you're telling these governments they need to get managed properly. You're telling these mismanaged governments they first of all need to go find help. They need to recognize I'm bad at being a government, which very few incompetent governments actually have the ability to do, because that would require a certain amount of sort of thinking in the long run, right? So first of all, you need that. Second of all, you need to be able to pay for this help, because even though everyone should do that, should help everyone, not everyone does that. It's great that they should, but they don't. And third of all, people need to actually trust these sort of flaky, incompetent governments to sort of take their advice and to pay them back. And fourth of all, people need to listen to this advice, which incompetent governments, which don't like sort of thinking in the long run, won't do. So if you just want a couple national parks, vote for Team Opposition. Thank you.
So today we have a side opposition, which has provided you with an alternative, which has provided you with a solution to better take out these poor countries of their situations. And we have a side proposition, which has told us nothing, but when you really think about it, but highlighting the existing problem. So ladies and gentlemen, today in my speech, I will first be demeriting their claims of the so-called negative effect of tourism on the country mentioned, and then I will be reinforcing the positive effects that side proposition has conveniently ignored. So, according to their definition, they have defined the value of tourism as whether or not it does more harm than good. And they have highlighted existing harms within foreign nations, such as the reliability of their existing sources of income, corrupt governments, essentially doing nothing but highlighting the status quo, failing to prove any harms that are linked to tourism, which was their job, indeed, to prove whether tourism was the right alternative for the people of poor countries. Now, on to the first negative aspects, the so-called negative aspects they've highlighted in today's debate. They have explained the incompetency of the government to handle such a situation and to handle such a foreign stimulant. And we see that, ladies and gentlemen, we agree. There are corrupt governments that exist in these countries. Nevertheless, the opportunity will create jobs, and although the impact will be less significant because the government has gotten their grubby hands on it, the job stimulant will allow, and the added money into the existing pool of money will nevertheless show a positive effect. And they've also questioned the incentive the government will actually have to further enhance the effect of tourism, such as joint venture projects and also enhancing the environment for tourist purposes. And we see, ladies and gentlemen, that if the government's sole purpose is looking for money, as side proposition paints them, then of course they're going to look towards protecting the environment and training and educating the people to enhance their money gains. So we see either way we have won this clash. Moreover, they've given us examples of students dropping out of school and limiting their career aspects and tailoring them to one specific area, which is tourism. And we see that in the case of dropping kids out of school, ladies and gentlemen, how likely is it for a kid who will drop their education at the drop of a hat to actually go to school in the first place? How likely? Thank you. How likely is someone in that situation to go to school anyway? Moreover, in the case of limiting their career aspects, we see, ladies and gentlemen, that it is not different to any other sources of income that they are. For example, the oil industry, the mining industry. Are kids not reliant on that too? And given the fluctuating nature of gas prices or the dependency on natural resources, we see that actually this adds another option. So in case one of the other sources of income does fall, this acts as, if you will, a safety net. Moreover, considering the reliability of the tourist industry in the first place, and we see that tourism adds another option which will help stabilize the possible job options for the people in the poor country. Moreover, we explain how tourism is a foreign stimulant, and that after a period of time, through the effects that my first speaker have highlighted down the bench, that the government will eventually be able to resume its normal activities and gain independence. And they have painted a very avid picture where they say that, okay, we are going to be so reliant on tourism so that when it goes away, we are going to be stranded in the desert, if you will. And we give you the example of the Bahamian Islands. When the Bahamian Islands tourism reached such an extent where the government was able to support itself, when a project was proposed by the Hilton Group, they were able to refute it because they were stable enough, because tourism provided enough economic stability to further enhance them, and they were able to reject a project which would severely harm the environment of the area. And so, ladies and gentlemen, we are looking at long-term stability versus short-term effects that do not exist at all. Now, they've explained how there should be a reallocation of resources and how it should go into healthcare and education. And we'd like to ask, ladies and gentlemen, where are these resources going to magically come from? That is the necessity. Yes, I'll take you.
Where are the resources that you're going to invest in tourism going to come from?
Exactly. We are going to have a foreign stimulant. When countries abroad see that this country does have the potential to support a tourism group, they will add investments in the form of hotels, national parks, etc., etc. And that is a foreign stimulant which generates jobs. But we don't see how money will magically appear from the existing pool of money. And it just proves the limited understanding of this debate by assuming that money will magically appear to support education and funding and things like that. Moreover, they've also gone on to say the environmental factors, and we see that this actually diverts the stress and strain on the environment as we provide another option. And tourism is actually heavily dependent on preserving the environment. In fact, ladies and gentlemen, it will help protect it as the government will further incentivize to reduce environmental strain. And that tourists indeed do have something to look at. And now that we've established the negative facts that are existing, allow me to reiterate the positive facts that, again, they have conveniently ignored. We've explained how this will generate jobs and will increase money in the current pool of money, further enhancing the stability of the economy. And the improvement of the infrastructure that will soon be associated with tourism will help improve the overall standard of living within the country. And also how it will protect the foreign environment and create a greater awareness of the area mentioned. So, ladies and gentlemen, when we look at this debate, it basically comes down to the side which has provided you with a clear-cut action to do something that will indeed actively help the people. Sure, ladies and gentlemen, there are some negative aspects, but we see that the positive ones are far outweighed, and their inability to highlight anything but the status quo proves that, ladies and gentlemen, that tourism is actually good for countries, ladies and gentlemen, which is why this
very clearly in my first speech, I said that tourism was not the magical solution. So we have some sort of action which we believe will be able to benefit the economy and the people. And what we see on the other side is an irresponsive proposition that is saying, no, let's just not do anything. We'll just sit on top of our feet and, well, see if magically some money will come into our economy. They acknowledged at first speaker that they said the resources needed for the starting up of tourism is very low. And then later they asked us, oh, hey, where is this money actually going to come from? And they further on went on this assumption of that corruption and unsustainability would naturally occur, and they had this huge fear factor. But ladies and gentlemen, we have stressed again and again that this is not unique to tourism, that this is not caused by tourism, and that these are just fundamental problems with less developed countries. So just because of these issues occurring in this country situation doesn't mean that tourism shouldn't be implemented. And we see that with tourism implemented and with people getting richer, then these problems might gradually be solved through the promoting of tourism and foreign interest into the country and people being richer and more aware of their threats. Furthermore, they seem to think that resource extraction is a much better idea, when themselves admitted as second speaker that resource extraction needs more money and needs more networking, and somehow that will magically mean that corruption won't occur, that unsustainability won't occur. But we see again that these are common issues that happen simply because they are less developed countries. So, and then on second speaker, they asked us, like, there are many countries with, AIDS and people dying because they're poor. But, ladies and gentlemen, again, there's action on this side and there's inaction on the other side, and completely no response about how else, right, could we actually stimulate this economy, which has been the fundamental case which we have been striving for today, which is basically that there's a lack of pool of money in a poor country, that there is no foreign injection and there's no interaction with the international economy, which is the fundamental way where you gain foreign cash and you expand your economy, and that provokes different industries and development, as I said as first speaker, the multiplier effect. And my second speaker then further to talk about the social benefits which we would derive from this situation, such as cultural exchanges, the preservation of and conservation of culture, which is only good to them. Right, ladies and gentlemen, there might be some adverse impacts done, but it is to nobody's incentive, it is not to the government's incentive or the people in those poor countries' incentive to say, hey, let's be short-sighted and wow, tourism is making so much money, so let's burn all our resources and just make as much money as possible, and then, well, we won't have any resources and we won't be making any money after that. So simply, they might be slightly short-sighted, but we don't see that these countries are crazy. So ladies and gentlemen, because we are proposing action that will actually remedy this situation and benefit poor countries, we stand for these people, and we are very proud,
Now, their second speaker pejoratively called us far-sighted. But that's exactly what we are. We look at sustainable development down and down the line in today's debate. And that's why the first class you really want to look at is economic and social benefits. This idea where their entire crutch of their case is good governance, ladies and gentlemen. And now let's claim common ground here, because there doesn't seem too much. We both agree that we love education and healthcare and everything, but we also agree that they have little money. Now you want to divert more of that money to tourism, ladies and gentlemen. They don't understand the term opportunity cost. And then firstly, we say bad governance, and they say not true. Never mind, no examples. And then later on, they conceded that in their third speaker that, yes, maybe they actually are corrupt governments. Then you say, hey, that's not fair. Everything fails anyways. And then we specifically outline why in the case of tourism it is exacerbated. But even if we didn't specifically outline that, that still doesn't prove their side of the debate that it's helpful for poor countries. Then we talked about this idea of investors and potential. We asked, where's the trust in it, ladies and gentlemen? Where's the incentive? Walk us through the rational calculus. And finally, we talked about this weird aspect about resource extraction. And we said we were never for it, ladies and gentlemen. Now, if you look at the trickle-down effect, we look at two main areas of this kind of living proximity, taking advantage of the infrastructure built, and this idea of jobs and education as such. We already, again, told you about the kind of opportunity cost for the jobs and the low-paying jobs, no rebuttal on their side. Secondly, in terms of the kind of the infrastructural benefits, they try to attack this by saying, oh, actually, most of the poor people are in the rural areas, so they benefit. But then again, we said, well, what if nobody keeps up this infrastructure? How do they benefit? Again, they say, well, it's an incentive of the government. Again, falling back on the governmental crutch, which we've already taken in today's debate. Finally, on this issue, next on this issue of this kind of cultural preservation, right? So they talked about, it kind of celebrates these cultures as such, but they never really responded to our characterization on third speaker about how this is a commercialized business. How if you really do want to make money from tourism and you think it benefits the country so much, are you going to choose every single culture? No, you're going to choose the one that makes you the most money. How is it protection of the culture when it's so Disneyfied, when it's been so tainted by money? Next, we look at the issue of environment, because I think this is their only benefit about, yay, parks, ladies and gentlemen. So we say in this case of parks, yes, maybe you will keep one or two parks, but we look at the general environment that people live in. We look at the general kind of cause and harm of this whole thing. So at the end of the day, what we are left with is a side opposition that has perhaps one benefit with a slew of harms, ladies and gentlemen. And last time we checked, this debate was measured by the overwhelming harms that tourism is bringing to bad countries. So we ask you, what's left?